Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. We're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. Winning the Cold War. The very definition of the Cold War was that we avoided shooting at each other by maintaining the strength to convince the enemy that we could gain nothing by turning the Cold War hot. This required a special kind of warrior, one who maintained the strength and will to fight, but the restraint and discipline to stand firm. And we have one such Cold War warrior today who will share his experiences of what it was like to stand on the wall ready to fight but remain leashed in. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain David Wensley.
Cindy, thank you very much. Amazing introduction. You do such a tremendous job here. We at the Lion Air Museum are a little bit jealous. I think we have 3 or 4 people that do her job. Together they don't manage to do half of what she does. So we'll talk to them when we get home. Really fine. Well, to start off with a light story about this scarecrow, and I think we can keep this whole presentation light and have a good time. It was not always a good time doing this job of Cold War air defense. I'm very happy to see a couple other F-86 pilots in the audience today. I don't know how many total. Any F-86 pilots, how many we got? At least 2. Well, let's make it 3. Very happy to see you here today. We have a lot of experiences to share, that we shared together and crossed paths, I'm sure, at one point or another. The time that I served was in the mid to late 50s. It was a very tense time in the Cold War. The Cold War was rather new, rather fresh. It began about 1947 when it became very clear that the Soviet Union was no longer our ally, but were going to be our adversary. And things developed very quickly after that. By the time I went into the service in 1955, the tensions were very high. People were fearful of what the Soviets might do, and we were building up our armaments as fast as we could, and they were doing the same thing on the other side of the fence. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to tell you about my experiences, and I can assure you that my short period of service in the Air Force was the most intense and most challenging period of my entire life. And I'm sure others who have been through military experience can verify. It was a time when, as you look back from our, let's say, older age that we are now, you can remember nearly everything that happened and every day that you spent in that service. And I can tell you that in my subsequent life as an engineer and an engineering manager and so on at McDonnell Douglas, I can probably quote some 5-year periods when I can't remember one thing I did. It's a very, very different kind of a life. I'm going to take us back now a little bit and talk about the evolution of the technology. I just want to remind everybody that until late in World War II, there were no jet aircraft. The jet age got its start in World War II. I'm going to walk you through a few points about these aircraft you see on the screen. The only countries that had jet engines at that time were Great Britain and Germany. The United States did not have a jet engine. Russia did not. Japan did not. But Great Britain developed the invention of Frank Whittle, which was a centrifugal flow type of jet engine, into an operating aircraft engine that powered the Gloucester Meteor. There were 2 of those engines. They called them the Goblins at that time. And then they were subsequently built by de Havilland and also then by Rolls-Royce, and went through a series of progressions in development to become a very widely used engine called the Rolls-Royce Nene or Nane aircraft engine. By the way, that's an odd name, N-E-N-E. Most people have never heard of it. What it is a river in England. Rolls-Royce decided to name all their engines after rivers. I don't know why, but they thought there was an analogy between the flow of the water through the stream and the flow of the air through the engine. I'm glad we didn't do that, or we might have some things named Mississippi and Monongahela and a few other names we wouldn't like. So I'm glad we just didn't do that. J33 worked pretty well, actually, and J47. On the right-hand side, on the upper photo, is a picture of a ME-262, a twin-jet engine that Germany introduced late in the war. 100 miles an hour faster than the fastest aircraft we had at the time. Very scary operation to be in a B-17 or a B-24, I would think, and see a stream of those, or even one or two coming at you so fast you couldn't train your guns on it. The ME-262 was powered by two jet engines of a different type, axial flow, which is a type of engine that are used almost as universally today in the jet aircraft industry. These were made either by BMW or by Junkers, but Junkers won basically the contract to build the production units for the 262 and also for the Arado 324 in the lower right, principally because their performance was a little better and their reliability was a little better. They could squeeze anywhere between 10 and 20 hours out of an engine before it had to be completely overhauled. Think about that, 10 or 20. How would you like to be flying a commercial airliner today knowing that the engines were only going to last 10 hours? A little scary. The middle photo on the right is the famous ME-163, the Comet. I have a very personal relation to that airplane. The instructor I had in jet school for T-33 was a former Luftwaffe pilot. He went into the Luftwaffe at age 14, and he finished his career in the Luftwaffe flying the Comet. What he did before that, he would never tell me, but I imagine there were a few American pilots that perhaps lost their lives as a result of work that he did either in a Focke-Wulf 190 or a ME-109. But they only selected the best pilots to try to fly that beast. On the lower left-hand corner is, of course, the Lockheed P-80 or F-80 as it was called later. The interesting point here is that when Kelly Johnson designed and built that first airplane in 143 days, we didn't have an engine. So we had to get the engines from Great Britain. They licensed GE to copy their engine. The same one that I mentioned was in the later models of the Gloster Meteor, and that's the engine that went into the P-80, also into several other aircraft, of course the T-33, as you well know. On the right hand, or the next screen, I'm going to bring up the MiG-15, Korea, 1950. The U.S. was caught with their pants down once again, not prepared for what they ran into in Korea when the Russian MiGs showed up. Again, here we are with a swept-wing jet-powered aircraft that we had no match for in the area at that time. We had the P-80s over there, and we had, of course, P-51s. The Navy had the Panthers, and incidentally, the Panthers, the P-80s, and the MiG-15s all used the same engine. After World War II, the wonderful new Prime Minister of England granted Russia the rights to the Rolls-Royce Nane engine, and he sold them 35 copies to make sure they'd get it right when they copied it. So they did. They reverse engineered it, they improved it a little bit, they expanded the combustion chambers, added a few more pounds of thrust, and came at us in Korea with a MiG-15 powered by a British engine, stolen and converted into a Russian variation, I might say. Not stolen, they were granted the privilege. They were not granted the privilege to copy it and produce it in thousands, which they did. Approximately 10,000 produced by a combination of Russia and China. We lost a lot of airplanes in the Korean War. We lost, I think, about 250 F-86s. We lost about maybe 300 P-80s. All of the numbers of all of our aircraft that were lost were very, very, very high, in that range of 200 to 300 airplanes. Most of the airplanes lost in the Korean War were not due to air-to-air combat. Only about 1 out of 10 were lost in air-to-air combat. The others were lost in air-to-ground action or in accidents. Remember that we're at the beginning of the jet age here. That's why I wanted to introduce that World War II stuff. The engines we had were not very reliable. The systems that we had to operate things on the aircraft were not very reliable. There were no transistors. It was all vacuum tubes. And a lot of this technology was new, and we were learning as we were going. At least the engineers were, and the manufacturers. The photo you see here at Kimpo, taken at Kimpo Air Base 1951, is a series of F-86s. I think these are A models. If you look at the leading edge of the lower aircraft here, you'll see the slats. The forward part of the wings would slide forward, gravity fed, roll out on little rails and slide forward and give the wing a larger chord, enabling it to create larger lift at low speeds, take off at a lower airspeed, land at a lower airspeed. But once it got underway, the air pressing against the leading edge would push those slats back into alignment with the main part of the wing, reduce the overall area of the wing, and allow it to reach its high speeds. The swept-back feature was also adopted from German work in World War II. At the end of the war, some of the people that went over there, both from the US and from Russia, found wind tunnel results and analytical results that showed the superiority of the swept-type wing to a straight wing to reduce the compressibility issue they had when they reached high-speed velocities. It might surprise some of you to know that the very first F-86 that was undergoing development had straight wings. It was not until this information was brought back from Germany during the process of developing the F-86 that the decision was made to use the German technique and sweep back the wings. That made all the difference in the world. Otherwise, our F-86 would have been very little better than the P-80s that we had at the time. While the Russians were building up their forces on the other side of our Cold War barrier, we were building up our own. We were building up a strategic air force under the Strategic Air Command. And on this photo, you see the famous Boeing B-47 Stratojet, first flew in 1951. An amazing airplane, a beautiful airplane. I'm sure most of you have seen one. Very high-tech, leading-edge design. If you've ever seen one fly, I've flown in one. As you know, the wings drooped down and nearly touched the runway as it taxied out and started to take off. But as it gained airspeed, the wings would curl up like this, and in flight, they took on a shape as I'm showing like this. A very awesome thing to see. 6 engines, J-47s, the same as the engine in the F-86, in this case using rocket-assisted takeoff. A rather difficult aircraft to fly. Any P-47 pilots in here or crew members? Good, then I can say anything I want to and no one will correct me. I would say a dangerous airplane to fly. About 2,000 were built and over 200 crashed. None of them in combat, all in training and in simulated bombing missions around the world. The B-52 on the right of the photo group, of course, is still flying today. Not the original version, not the original engines, a lot of modifications, but is still the main workhorse of our strategic air forces. While we were doing that, the Soviets were busy on their side of the fence. These are some of the bombers that we were tracking through our limited abilities to snoop on the Russian air forces, mainly through their May Day parades where they showed off their best and latest accomplishments, and through spies and defectors and a little bit of reconnaissance activity. We didn't have satellites at that time, remember, so we couldn't really survey their airfields and their factories and their production activities. We had to make guesses at how many they were producing. And they were good at trickery. At least on the Bison, when they showed that in the May Day parade, they showed a large stream of those aircraft flying over Red Square. But they were circling around and coming back from the other end and just going around and around in a racetrack. But who's going to know? Those are the aircraft that we were concerned about in the middle 50s. When I went in, I got my commission in 1955 and was soon in the pipeline training to fly the F-86D and L interceptors. And our job was going to be to find those aircraft, intercept them, and take them down. By the way, if you think the Cold War is over, think again. You see what this says? One of the latest Russian bombers, nuclear carrying bomber, long range, high speed, I think about a Mach 1.5 aircraft. I'm not sure about that. Someone might correct me. The Tupolev 160. Two of those, at least at the end of last year, were in Venezuela, right on our back door. I don't know if they're still there now, and I don't know if they're carrying nuclear weapons. But there is still a Cold War going on, and some opinions it is escalating. Let's hope not. So when the Air Force began looking at the threat coming from these Russian bombers that they knew were being developed and produced, they looked to the arsenal of interceptors that we had, and principally the best that we had online was the F-86, but it was a day fighter. It was designed for air-to-air combat and air-to-ground. It was not designed for night work or all-weather work. It was not designed to take out a bomber with one shot, and that's really what we needed, or they needed. Oh, by the way, I want to mention that the F-86 was a fast airplane at the time. I believe it set a record of 560 miles per hour in 1948. And in 1953, the D model, which I flew, and a couple of my new friends here flew, as well as the L model, which was almost the same airplane. Anyway, the D model in 1953 reached a speed of 715 miles per hour, right out here over the Salton Sea, flying about 100 feet off the deck. Much faster airplane. We had all-weather interceptors in the early 1950s. We had the F-94 on the right side of the photo group, and you'll recognize the F-94 as being a stretched P-80. We're right back to that same old original airplane from Kelly Johnson that he designed in 143 days, only now it's got a stretched fuselage, it's added an afterburner, and it's got a radar on the nose, and it's carrying rockets. That was one of our frontline all-weather interceptors in the 1950s. On the left is the Northrop F-89 Scorpion, a twin-engine airplane, also with afterburners, also carrying rockets, and in both cases, these are aircraft that require two crew members, a pilot to fly the airplane and a backseat crewman to operate the radar and the fire control system. I want to divert to a little personal anecdote. While I was waiting to get an assignment in flight school, I had some time to kill. I just graduated from university with a degree in electrical engineering, so I came out here and I got a job at Douglas Aircraft. I had a lot of offers from companies like RCA and GE and Westinghouse and so on, but Douglas paid more money, $448 a month, and that included Saturday overtime, so I jumped on that. After a couple of weeks of making design changes on DC-3 airplanes and DC-4 airplanes with rolls of drawings piled on my drawing board every morning when I came to work, with an engineering order wrapped around them. Anybody know about EOs? Yeah, okay, there are a few in the crowd. I said, this is not for me. So I found a way to switch over to the missile division. And I was assigned to the Genie project. It was under development at the time. And within a few weeks, I was only there a few months, about 6 months, but within 3 or 4 weeks, they assigned me to design the fuse assembly that triggered the atomic warhead in this air-to-air missile, right out of school. Well, after a few days working on that I was having some trouble. I had to feed a detonation signal into the warhead, but I didn't know what the electrical characteristics were. So I asked my boss for some help. He reached in his desk and pulled out a phone number and a name, and he copied it down for me on a piece of paper. He says, "Call this guy." I said, "Okay." I called this guy, who happened to be someone at Sandia, where they assembled the atomic warheads, and I told him my dilemma. He said, "You got a pencil and paper?" I said, "Yeah." So he dictated to me the electrical circuitry that was in the warhead, and I drew the diagram on the paper and assigned the resistance and the inductance and the capacitance of the components and all that, and stuck that in my drawer. That's how we did things in those days. Security was not very high level. By the way, that rocket was only fired once to test it with an actual atomic warhead. It was launched from an F-89 out in New Mexico, and miraculously the F-89 survived. It's on a pedestal out there somewhere. I don't think it was flyable after that mission, by the way. So the Air Force decided we need a better all-weather interceptor, and we got to get rid of that guy in the back seat. He's taking up too much space and weighs too much. So we'll cram all the jobs into the pilot's compartment, let him do all the work. So they came up with the what was originally called the F-95, but because they were having difficulty getting funding out of Congress, they changed it to F-86D. It retained about 25% of the original F-86 componentry and design features, such as the entire wing, for example, and the tail, but obviously not the fuselage and some other components of the aircraft. They were all new. It was to carry an afterburner, a radar. You see the big black radome on the nose. You see the characteristic leading edge slats on the wing that were retained on the F-86D and F-86L. It also contained rockets. You can't see the rockets in this photo, but there's a rocket pod that dropped down under the nose that exposed the rocket array of 24 rockets. They could be fired off, and the tray dropped down, the rockets fired, and the tray or pod retracted back in the fuselage in, what was it, 2 seconds, I think? Very, very fast. So that was to keep the pod from adding drag to the aircraft and enabling it to maintain its high speed. So that was the airplane I was destined to fly. Well, before I could do that, I had to learn to fly something. I didn't know how to fly anything when I started, obviously. So I went to primary flight school in Moore Air Base in McAllen, Texas, and started flying the T-34. You'll recognize that if you haven't flown one or seen one before. It's basically a beach bonanza, but with a tandem cockpit and a conventional tail. Very easy plane to fly, a fun thing to learn in. After about 7 hours, you got to solo, and that was a really big deal. From there, we went to, at that time in the training process, we were out of the tail dragger classes of aircraft, and we were into tricycle gear. The Air Force was using the T-28. This was a much larger aircraft, and for someone stepping out of a T-34, which was a toy, and walking up to this beast, it was quite a shock. You mean I have to fly that, you know? Well, it turned out to be very easy to fly. I don't know how many people have flown a T-28, Air Force or Navy, quite a few in here. Uh-oh, we got some Navy people? Uh-oh. Uh-oh, you're not going to like the next slide and the next story. All right, so the T-28 was fully equipped for aerobatics, for instrument flying, training, for night flying, and a wonderful airplane to fly. I had a unique experience when I finished the course. Again, I had to wait for an opening in jet school, so I had 2 or 3 weeks, I forget how long, and they said, well, just go out and take an airplane anytime you want, and just keep current. So I would tell my wife, be out in front of our apartment house at 10 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to be flying over, and I'd go out and check out an airplane, and I'd go fly over the apartment, which was in downtown McAllen, Texas, and I'd do everything I had learned in the syllabus, you know, rolls, chandelles, figure eights, loops, vertical recoveries. When I got through the whole syllabus, then I'd go back and land, and wait till the next day and do it all over again. So that was a lot of fun. Okay, the Navy flew the same airplane except with a bigger engine, heavier landing gear, and they also came with 2 grandkids. I've often been asked, well, why did the Navy use a bigger engine with 3-bladed prop, and why did they have to have a heavier landing gear and all that? Well, I don't know anything about carrier landings, but what I've been told is when they approach the carrier deck, the typical Navy pilot just turns his head and covers his eyes and lets it crash. I don't know. Am I wrong about that? That's pretty much it. All right, I'm going to walk you through a series here of about 4 photos of the T-33. I love this airplane. Any of you have flown the T-33, I'm sure you'll say the same thing. What a beautiful machine that Kelly Johnson designed. And unbelievable that he got so much sophistication into that very first jet that the United States produced. This, of course, is the same as a P-80, but it's stretched to put a larger canopy and a dual cockpit in there. Instructor would be in the rear and the student in the front. I'm showing it taking off. Don't tell my instructor, but I was taking photos as we started going through formation training here. And over in the left-hand corner, this is my version of the Scarecrow. It turns out, as I mentioned earlier, my instructor pilot was a second lieutenant named Carl Grosch, who got his training in the Luftwaffe. Since he had flown the rocket plane, the Comet, each of the instructors had a poster above their table that had their call sign on there and some kind of a symbol representing their call sign. So he asked me to make a poster of a rocket, and he wanted to call his flight the rocket flight. So I designed and painted that rocket. That, of course, is my instructor sitting on the back with a whip, and the poor student on the front cowering as he streaked through the sky. I didn't know it at the time. I'd already had some experience working on a rocket for a few months at Douglas, but that was going to be the rocket as an emblem or as a symbol or a product of modern technology was going to be woven through my life for the rest of my career. I'll tell you more about that later. The next photo just shows a close-in formation. I pulled up tight to the lead aircraft, and the instructor in the back is giving a signal for leveling off. And as those of you that have flown formation are well aware, in general, there are no voice commands. It's all hand signals. It's all rocking the wings to shift you from echelon right to in trail or to echelon left and back and forth and so on. And those are the things you learn during training. It comes in very useful in the squadron. When you're flying a single-engine jet aircraft in a fighter squadron, you're in formation every day at one point and another with 1 other or 3 other pilots and aircraft. So this just shows a sequence of photos of the maneuvers that were made typically during the training in the T-33. Well, it was time now to move on. I finished the work in the T-33. Hopefully I learned everything I was supposed to learn, and move on to the next choice. And I had my choice. I could have chosen day fighters, night or all-weather fighters, bombers, tankers, transports, or whatever. And I chose to go to the F-86D all-weather because I thought it was more complicated, be a bigger challenge, and I think I got my wish. It was asking a lot to master this thing. Anyway, there's a photo of it, and there you can see on the lower part of the nose, you can see the rocket pod carried 24 rockets. You could select 6 or 12 or 24 as you made your pass against the enemy aircraft or the simulated enemy aircraft, which is what we used in training. Also shows the fuel tanks, droppable fuel tanks under the wings, which were pretty essential. A typical mission in this aircraft ran, 45 minutes, less than an hour typically. And I'll point out later, the maximum you could possibly squeeze out of a long endurance flight was 2 hours. That turned out to be a significant number to me in a later point that I'll tell you about. After training at Moody in Valdosta, Georgia, oh, and by the way, there is a feature of the F-86 that I'm sure my compatriots over here recall very well. We were warned, and by the way, there are no two-seat aircraft, so the first time you flew the F-86D or L, you were solo in the aircraft. You got some paper instruction and some advice from an instructor who then took off in formation off to your side and watched you through your first flight. And you were warned that on rare occasion, after takeoff, the aircraft could become unstable in pitch and start doing this. That happened to me on my first flight. And they describe that, or they call that the JC maneuver, because every time it happened to a pilot, a student, he would say, "Jesus Christ, what's that?" The solution in the book was to let go of the control stick and let the aerodynamics damp the aircraft oscillation out. I ain't doing that. So my solution was to grab that stick and hold it as tight as I could, avoid putting some more motion into the oscillation, which is what you would do because you couldn't track the motion of the aircraft fast enough. So anyway, that never happened again. I knew how to avoid that on all subsequent flights. So at Westover Air Force Base, I entered the 324th Fighter Squadron. We were flying F-86Ls. Again, there was no great training program for that. Here's the manual. Take a look at the cockpit, get familiar with it. Those are the differences, and have a nice day. Well, my first day on the job was quite an experience. I don't know if I mentioned, but where I went to school was at the University of Miami. I was born and raised in Miami, and I had never seen snow. So again, I got my choice of what squadron to join, and there was an opening in the 324th at Westover, Massachusetts. So I said, oh boy, snow. I'll get to see snow. I'll take that. So I went up there in December, and the snow was, well, I'm kind of short, but it was a little bit taller than I was everywhere, and it was pretty exciting. Except the first day on the job, the squadron commander said, well, go check out an airplane and go fly around and get familiar with the area. Locate the other fields around, take a good look at Westover so you recognize it, look for the landmarks, watch out for the mountains, you know, and have a nice time. So I took off, and it was a pretty gray day. And I was VFR, visual flight rules. It was overcast and gray. It started getting darker and darker. And after half an hour, 40 minutes, I decided I better get back to this field and land this thing because I can hardly see. By the time I got back to the field, all I could see was Westover underneath me. I started orbiting around and called for a clearance to land. They said negative. We have a squadron of 4 taking off. So I orbited the field while I watched these 4 take off and disappear into the gloom, and then I was cleared to land. I came in and landed, and as I was rolling down the runway, opened the canopy, and snow started coming in. Oh, wow, this is pretty exciting. Great big chunks of it like that. I couldn't wait to feel it on my face, but after a few minutes of glee, that sensation went away. I went into the flight shack, and we could hear the ground controllers and the pilots on the radios that were broadcast in the flight shack. And 4 aircraft were recalled to land. 3 of them landed on radar GCA approaches, and the 4th one couldn't land. The ceiling had dropped below minimums. We all went out of the flight shack, and the runway was right there, right? We could hear his airplane, but we couldn't see him. And he made 3 or 4 passes over the runway, and we could hear him come down, then hear him punch the throttle and climb up again. And on the 4th one, the engine just stopped, and suddenly it was dead silence. We all went in wondering what had happened, and after about a half an hour, he walked in the flight shack with his parachute under his arm. He had ejected over the field, and the plane had crashed in the city dump. This is what it looked like on a good day at Westover. This is more like a normal day in the winter at Westover. This is a very old photo showing in the center the alert hangars and some other maintenance buildings that were added long after I was there, but that's kind of what it looked like. The job at Westover was to protect the B-47 bombers that were stationed there. And again, the mission was very simple. If the bad guys come over the North Pole and across Canada and head for our cities and our air bases, your job is to go up there, find them, and shoot them down. And that's what we trained for. That's what we practiced every day and every night. In between practice missions, we stood alert, or we flew as simulated bombers, either in a T-33 or in an F-86. Here's what the field looked like at Westover. If you take a look at the lower part of the picture, you see an angled taxiway going out to the main runway. It's on about a 45-degree angle. And at the lowest part of the photo, you can see those alert hangars that we stationed our aircraft in. We would have 2 aircraft on 5-minute alert, 2 on backup stationed right behind the first 2, and then others on 15-minute alert somewhere on the base. And in the second hangar, set of hangars over to my right was another squadron, the 337th, and they had also F-86Ls, and they were also on 5-minute alert and 15-minute alert and backup, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If a scramble came, you jump in the aircraft, the crew jumps on the aircraft, helps you get strapped in and started, and then you put it in a full throttle position, and when the engine spools up, it bursts you out of the hangar onto that 45-degree taxiway, throttle back a little bit, make a sharp turn, try not to peel the tires off, and down the runway and burner, and you're airborne. Boy, was that fun. Am I right? That was really fun. This is what it looked like to the ground crew, running out of the warm shelter they had and up onto the wing of the aircraft and getting the APU started, get the engine started, and helping the pilot get going. Now I want to show you what it was like inside the airplane and try to walk you through how the fire control system worked and what we practiced every day. These are 2 shots of the inside of an F-86D cockpit. Not sure what versions of the F-86Ds these were. They're not exactly the same, but I think you kind of get the idea. Down in front of the pilot, right in the center of the instrument panel, is that little round radar scope. It's about, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches in diameter. And on the right photo, you see the glare shield that was normally over the display. That's to keep out all extraneous light. Also, if there's explosions going on around you, they're not going to blank out the screen. So once you started in the search mode for the target, you got your head down into that rubber glare shield, and all you're looking at is that little round screen and the information that was displayed on it. There were no heads-up displays in those days. That had not been invented yet. So everything you got was on that little screen, and there wasn't much. You had no view, of course, of your instruments and no view of your engine controls or anything else, just the symbols and the diagram on the screen. We'll go to the next photo. These are a couple of pages out of the training manual from 1957. The type of intercept was called lead collision. This is not the same type of an intercept that a day fighter would fly. Let me try to put it this way. The bombers we expected to go against were probably just as fast as our fighters. So the best chance you had was to come at them from a broadside or a little bit ahead of broadside and or behind broadside, but giving you plenty of closing speed on the bomber coming in from the side. Be almost impossible to catch from the tail. Even in burner. We could go Mach 1. I did it once, but you had to go in the F-86D or L. The way you went through Mach 1, the speed of sound, was to take it up to altitude, point it straight down at the ground, and put it in an afterburner and punch your way through. So not something you did on a daily basis. I did it once. It was fun. On the right screen, you see what's on the display. You'll see two green dots in the photos up there. One of them is the target moving down that vertical black line. The target dot in this image is about 14 or 15 miles away. We would typically pick up the target at 25 or 30 miles away, and from then on you would be flying this screen. You lock on to the target using another hand control off on the left side behind the throttle, and then from that point the Hughes control system, a fire control system, would track the target automatically and then deliver you a steering dot, a second image, a second little green image on the screen. The steering dot, in order to make a hit or a kill, had to be directly in the center of that screen, right on the center, and near the end of the run, the little circle that you see in the center would collapse into a line of about 1/4 of an inch wide, and you had to be on that line. You had to have the dot on that line, wings level, no turning, and when you got to the right point in the approach path, the fire control system would automatically drop the pod, release the rockets, pull the pod back up, and show you an X on the screen indicating you had completed the run, you'd released your rockets, and you scored a hit. Then you'd break away, right past the tail of the bomber in front of you. So the control system, the fire control system, calculated a true collision course and then calculated an angle off of that which compensated for the faster speed of the rockets so that you would miss the aircraft, not run into it. Oddly enough, one of the failure modes of that system was it would calculate the collision course but not add the correction. Hello. Oh my, I forgot to tell you something that was very important, and this is what reminded me. Let's think back to Westover. When I was flying out of there, often we would have, and you guys would remember this too, we would have joint exercises with squadrons from around the Boston air defense sector. And I was scheduled to fly in one on a particular snowy, imagine that, cold day in Massachusetts. And I was going to fly as a target in a T-33 in a V formation along with 2 other T-33s from other bases. And taxiing out to take off, my radio failed. I didn't turn it off, honestly. Anyway, the radio failed, so I had to turn around and go back. I didn't have time to get another aircraft, so they scrubbed my flight. I went back to the flight shack. They scrambled another T-bird from New York, from, what was the name of it? Stewart, from Stewart Air Force Base. And that fellow, that crew of 2 went up and took my place along with my companion in the squadron that was coming in over from the Canadian border and coming down heading towards Boston. They were intercepted by a squadron from Otis Air Force Base flying F-94s. One of the F-94s collided with the airplane that took my place, and 2 pilots were killed. So there, but for the grace of God and all that. Okay, back to the story here. So one bright sunny day, an F-104 arrives at Westover Air Force Base, piloted by the commander of the 337th, Colonel James Jabara, from Korean War fame. I think he had 15 MiGs to his credit. And he brought in the first of a squadron of F-104s. We thought we were going to get F-104s. Guess what? For every first prize, there's a second prize. We got SIDI SLIMANE, Morocco. Where the hell is that? Well, even with this photo sectional chart, you're not sure where it is, but what you're looking at in the lower part is the northwest corner of Africa, and in the upper part is the south end of Spain, about 170 miles away. You probably see a little red line down there near the bottom of the photo. That's a SIDI SLIMANE Air Base runway. Another red dot up there is Gibraltar. That's probably some place that most people have heard of. I wish they'd have said, you're going over to a base right near Gibraltar. Everyone has said, oh, yippee, we're going to have fun there. Well, there's not a lot of fun in SIDI SLIMANE, I can tell you that. But there we were. Within a short period of time, we all had our airplanes. They were old D models. They'd been shipped over from New Orleans by ship and assembled in Brindisi. And then they had to be ferried from there over to SIDI. So the squadron commander and his head shed started bringing them back. Well, we had 25 airplanes and 25 pilots. So our logic was, that's one airplane per pilot. Let's go get them, right? They said no. And the ops officer came up with a reason, a rationale, which was, you can't go unless you've been. So that became our squadron motto after that. And by the way, there's that famous Rock of Gibraltar. I think many of you have seen that on the Prudential insurance ads. This is a photo I took up there. But I want you to look at the top of the peak of the rock. The rock is not a pyramid like this. It's a long thing, maybe 4 times as long as it is wide. And the wind comes from the north and sweeps up the face of the rock and starts to dump its water and then comes over the top as a cloud. And from SIDI SLIMANE, when you took off there heading north for the Mediterranean, all you had to do was scan the horizon. It was usually clear. You'll find one cloud. That's where Gibraltar was. You couldn't miss it. So we flew those missions doing practice intercepts. In this case, the mission was to protect the B-47 bombers that were coming over TDY from Homestead. They'd be over there for, I forget what, 2 or 3 weeks. Then they'd go back home. And our job was to make sure that if the bad guys came, they would be able to get off the ground and climb out and get on their heading to their targets in the Soviet Union. So we practiced that day or night, and we stood alerts, of course, 24/7. Most of the time, we were scrambled against unidentified aircraft. A lot of unidentifieds usually turned out to be British or French, military, sometimes commercial, but there was very little coordination between any of the agencies that monitored or tracked aircraft in the area. So usually the method of finding out was to go find them, get up close, read their markings and numbers and report those back, and they were always friendlies. Once in a while we got off the base and saw a few of the surrounding things. This is something that the French named Fantasia. The local Arabs would line up at one end of this field, and then on a signal or a gunshot, they'd all charge across the field, firing these long flintlock rifles and screaming and yelling. I don't know what it was meant for, but I called it the charge of the Moroccan Light Brigade. I guess that was their version of standing alert and then shooting with flintlocks. Another thing that was good duty was if you got the opportunity to take a worn-out bird back to Torino, to the Fiat factory, for what was called Iran. It had nothing to do with the country. It meant inspection and repair as necessary. I'm sure most of you know about that. And I was doing that one day, flying wing on my good friend, another pilot in the squadron, and Lieutenant Jay Edwards. Jay ultimately became a major general and head of the Logistics Air Command in Oklahoma City, where he retired and still resides. Anyway, there I am sitting on the runway or on the ramp at Zaragoza. We got airborne out of there. I had a few things wrong with my aircraft. The attitude indicator didn't work. One of the fuel tanks didn't feed, so I was running short on fuel. The airplane was lopsided, so I had to trim that out, so I was consuming more than my lead aircraft. We got over Torino, and it was supposed to be high scattered and 7 miles vis, and we were socked in all the way down to about 200 feet. So we descended. Jay finally got us below the overcast, and again, I landed in snow. It was Westover all over again, and taxied off the runway, pulled into a parking slot and flamed out of gas. Another thing I got to do over there is, I won't explain the circumstances here, but I got a hop in a B-47 from SIDI to Homestead. But I learned during that flight that they didn't fly direct. They actually turned the transfer flight into a simulated bombing mission. So they flew over the Midwest, I forget where, Kansas City, I don't remember what. Anyway, running making bombing runs on simulated ground targets before they finally turned and headed back southeast to Homestead to land. And why that was great for me is my wife and child were back there. My son had been born in Massachusetts when we were on duty up there, and this was my first time to see him since I'd transferred over to SLIMANE. So I had 3 glorious days at Miami Beach, and as you can see, my son wasn't having any of it. He didn't know who this guy was, never wanted to see him again. So I decided at that time I was going to refuse the offer from my squadron commander for re-upping for 2 years and bringing my wife and son over. I decided I'd go back to civilian life, return to a life of rocketry at McDonnell Douglas, or Douglas, which then became McDonnell Douglas. So I made that decision. So for the last month, the squadron commander had the word out, don't let that you-know-what fly. He's not going to earn his flight pay from me. So I'd go to the flight shack every day and hope that my name would be on the board, but it never was. But I'd hang around all day anyway. And one day an airman walked out of administrative office with an envelope, and he says, I need somebody to take this back to division headquarters at Rabat. I said, I can do it. I grabbed it and ran as fast as I could and jumped in the first airplane, and I headed for Rabat. Well, guess how much time I logged? 2 hours, right? And I've got to come back. That's another 2 hours. 4 hours means $150 flight pay. So before I left Rabat, I took off from Rabat, circled around, called in, and requested permission to do a high-speed flight over the runway. And the tower operator said, permission denied. I said, Roger, understand, affirmative, coming down. So I came down to the runway, put it in burner, pulled up in front of the tower, did a series of rolls, and headed back home for SLIMANE and collected my $150. So I left the Air Force. I did get back into rocketry and flight control, from manned aircraft to manned spacecraft. I had prominent roles on many activities, including being Vice President for integration on the International Space Station. And my last job, I was VP and GM for fully reusable launch vehicle that we tested out in New Mexico. Pete Conrad, the famous astronaut, was my operations guy. He flew the DCX in New Mexico, and you're seeing a sequence shot here. The rocket would take off, would fly vertically, then translate like a helicopter, go anywhere you wanted to, and then go land somewhere else, or come right back to where it took off and land on all 4 feet and be ready to go again as soon as you cleaned it up and refueled it. Unfortunately, neither the Air Force, who was our customer at that time, nor NASA, nor the company wanted to pursue that any further. It was a huge investment required, so that project died. And that was the end of my career. And thank you very much for attending. It's been wonderful to be here with you. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Was a target acquisition visual? Negative. The target acquisition was with the radar. You were positioned by the ground control radar to that point about 30 miles away, okay, on a broadside angle, hopefully, although we practice approaching from astern as well as from head-on, but most of the practice was from broadside. And you'd be positioned so that you knew approximately what angle the target would be at, like 30 degrees to port or whatever, and then you'd stick your head in into the glare shield and start searching for that dot. Then you lock onto it, and from then on, the fire control system took over. The question is, did the combustion of the rockets give the engine a problem? The answer to that is yes. It's possible you would get a flame out from the combustion of the rockets. We didn't practice with rockets. We practiced with a tape recorder, which recorded the image that you saw on the display. And after every flight, the pilot would remove the tape recorder and go in, put it on a monitor, and then his flight commander or squadron commander would review that, and you would get scored on each run that you made each day. Took me a while to start getting a continuous sequence of good scores. Did everybody get that? He flew with rockets at the base he was at. We didn't have an area we could shoot in except out over the Atlantic, and so he said that they would deploy the debris screens in front of the engine first and then also turn on the ignition. So in case they did get a flame out from firing the rockets, they'd get a restart right away, hopefully, before the engine spooled down. Question is, when you had your face down in that glare shield, how did you fly the airplane? If you recall the diagram, there were two little horizontal black lines. Those are the wings of the airplane, and that image was driven by the gyro, so that if you saw the wings tilted, you knew that was the angle of your wings, and that's what you flew. How did the F-86 compare to the F-89? It would climb faster. It had faster maximum airspeed. I think the altitudes were similar, maximum altitude. However, the 86 could get to altitude much faster. It climbed at about 12,500 feet per minute. So you get up to your intercept altitude very quickly. That was the main advantage of the 86s. The question was, would the Nike Zeus or Nike Hercules anti-aircraft missiles that we had stationed in the U.S. in the north might mistake us as being a Russian Badger, for example? Frankly, I never thought about that. Now that you mentioned it, I'm kind of worried. Anything else? That's it? Okay, we're done. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.